What is up, everybody, and welcome back to Small Lake City. If you're new here, my name is Eric, and I'm your host, and this is where we talk about the stories that make Utah what it is. The culture, the characters, the weird headlines, and the stuff people don't tell you before you moved here, and things you only found out growing up here. And starting right now, this is officially my first long-form deep dive into Utah lore, Utah history, Utah crime, and all the stories that feel way too wild to be real. And if that's something you want more of, make sure to hit that subscribe button. So let's jump into it. Now, I need to know if you have seen this woman's face. Because for a while there, it felt like you couldn't drive anywhere in Utah, or honestly, anywhere in the country without seeing it. A billboard, a portrait of a woman smiling, and underneath it, just a simple message that says, "In loving memory of Julia Reagan." Now, if you're like me, at first you see one and you're like, okay, but then you see another one, and another one, and another one. Until all of a sudden, it feels like it's not just a billboard, it starts to become a thing. And for me personally, when I drove anywhere, it was basically guaranteed I would see at least one of these billboards. But seeing one was one thing, but once I started seeing them nearly every mile on the freeway and on major roads, it started to feel different. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt very intentional. So today, we're finally answering the question everyone has been asking. Who was Julia Reagan? And more importantly, why did her face end up on hundreds of billboards across the country? Because here's the thing. At first, this looks like a simple tribute, a husband honoring his late wife. But once you learn what happened to her and what happened after she passed, all of a sudden, there's another reason these billboards could be everywhere. And by the end of this, I want to ask you the question that this whole story leads to. Were these billboards purely the tribute of a grieving husband? Or are they also meant for something else? And make sure to comment because I want to know what's going through your mind the entire time you watch this video. So let's get into it. So first, who was Julia Reagan? Julia Reagan wasn't a celebrity, she wasn't a politician, she wasn't some public figure that everyone already knew. And that's part of what made this story explode. Millions of people were seeing her face, but almost nobody knew anything about her. But Julia Reagan was the wife of Bill Reagan, and Bill Reagan is the owner of Reagan Outdoor Advertising. If you live in Utah, you've seen Reagan billboards your entire life. They're everywhere. I-15, I-80, downtown Salt Lake, the suburbs, you can't miss them. But Reagan Outdoor Advertising isn't just big in Utah. They operate across multiple states. So once you understand that part, you start to understand why Julia Reagan's face didn't show up just in Utah and in Salt Lake City. It showed up all over the country. And when you're seeing it as a normal person driving to work, you don't think, oh, that's because of billboard operations. You think, who is this and why am I seeing her everywhere? And that was the exact moment this turned into a national mystery. But behind the billboards, there's a real story. And it starts with Julia's health. Now here's where I want to be careful. I'm not going to speculate on private medical details, but it has been publicly reported that Julia had been dealing with health issues and had traveled for medical care. And according to reports tied to the lawsuit that came later, her final days were connected to ongoing medical treatment. One of the details that has been reported is that Julia had been to the Mayo Clinic in Arizona shortly before her death. So picture this. Someone you love has been dealing with health conditions. You're traveling for care. You're doing the best you can. And you're going to the top-tier medical institutions known all over the country. And then things take a turn. According to the wrongful death lawsuit filed later by Bill Reagan, Julia returned to Utah, started feeling unwell, and she was admitted to the University of Utah Hospital. And this is where the story gets real. Because the lawsuit alleges that Julia's care at University of Utah Hospital involved negligence. And these are the allegations in the lawsuit. But they're claims and they have not been proven yet in court. But they are an important part of the public story now because they change how people interpret everything that came after. The lawsuit reportedly claims that Julia should have been kept upright in order to prevent aspiration. But the complaint alleges that she vomited multiple times and aspirated, which means fluid entered her lungs. And according to the lawsuit, that led to severe damage and ultimately cardiac arrest. And Julia Reagan passed away at University of Utah Hospital on June 12, 2024. Now, whether you've ever been through something like this personally or not, we all understand the reality here. A death like that is devastating. It's sudden, it's traumatic, and for a family, it's the kind of thing that changes everything. And for most families, that's where the story stays private. A funeral, a memorial, friends and family mourning, maybe a post online. But for the Reagan family, that's not what happened. Because within months, Julia Reagan became unavoidable. Hundreds of billboards started going up, not just in Utah, across the entire country. A simple memorial, a face most people didn't recognize, and a line that gave no explanation: in loving memory of Julia Reagan. And just like that, Julia Reagan became one of the most recognized faces in America that almost nobody could identify. And I don't think people fully understand how rare that is, because most billboards are designed to sell you something. A concert, a soda, a lawyer, a car. But these billboards weren't selling anything. They weren't promoting anything. There wasn't a website. There wasn't even a message beyond in loving memory. So naturally, people did what people do. They asked questions. And once the questions started, the internet did its job. It was on TikTok. It was on Instagram. It was people making videos saying, "Who is this woman?" It was people saying, "I've seen her in 4 states." It was people making jokes. People made memes. Some people were respectful and some people weren't. But either way, it became a cultural moment. And I want to be honest, even if you didn't mean to participate, you kind of did. Because if you saw these billboards enough times, you started to wonder. It's human nature. Curiosity kicks in. And what made it even stranger was that there wasn't a clear public story at first, because Julia wasn't famous. So people naturally filled in the blanks themselves. Some people assumed she was a local legend. Some people assumed it was a campaign for something bigger. And some people assumed it was just marketing. And some people even assumed that it was something darker. But then the lawsuit became part of the public conversation. In February of 2025, Bill Reagan filed a wrongful death lawsuit tied to Julia's death. And the lawsuit claims that her death was preventable, that proper steps weren't taken, that she could have survived. Now, the University of Utah health system hasn't publicly commented on the details, which is normal because of ongoing litigation. But for the public, the lawsuit changes the entire feeling about the billboards. Because once you know there's a lawsuit, you look at the billboards differently. And that's where the main question of this video comes from. Because if you take the lawsuit out of the story, the billboards feel like grief, big grief, public grief. But when you add the lawsuit back into the story, it opens the door to a second interpretation. And that's what I want to talk about. Because here's the skeptical angle, and I don't think it's crazy to ask. If you own one of the biggest billboard companies in the country, and your wife tragically dies, and you believe that death was preventable, and you file a lawsuit against a major hospital system, is it possible that putting her face everywhere also serves another purpose? Not just a tribute, but attention. Not just memory, but visibility. Not just honoring her, but creating pressure. And I'm not saying that in a pessimistic way, I'm saying it in a realistic way. Because the University of Utah is not some small business. This is one of the biggest healthcare systems in the state, and one of the biggest employers in Utah. A massive organization. And lawsuits against institutions like that don't happen quietly unless both sides want them to. And the billboards ensured that Julia Reagan's story would not be quiet. It ensured that people across the country saw her face. It created a public emotional connection to someone they never met. And it made the story impossible to ignore. And that's why this gets tricky, because two things can be true at the same time. It can be a grieving husband honoring his wife, and also a powerful strategy in a major legal battle. In fact, if I'm being honest, it would be kind of naive to think that someone running a billboard empire doesn't understand the power of public messaging, even if the main reason was love, and the secondary effect is influence. And Julia's billboards became a form of storytelling, a public narrative and a constant reminder that someone died, and that her family believes that should not have happened. So, if you've ever wondered why the billboards didn't explain her story, I think that's part of why. Because if they said too much, it would turn into an argument. But if they said too little, it turns into a mystery. And mystery creates attention. And attention creates conversation. And conversation creates pressure. And now, over a year after Julia has passed away, the billboards have come down. But not necessarily forever. The idea was that they would return annually around Memorial Day, like a yearly wave of remembrance. And again, that's both beautiful and eerie. It's like Julia Reagan becomes a sensational presence, a reminder, a tribute, but also a symbol. And at this point, the internet debate basically split into two groups. One group said, this is love, this is grief, and this is a husband doing the only thing he knows how to do, using billboards to honor the person he lost and the love of his life. And the other group said, hold on, this is also a lawsuit, and there's no way these two things aren't connected. So here's my take. I don't think it's fair to call the billboards a scam. I don't think it's fair to call them heartless, because grief makes people do huge things. But I also don't think it's fair to pretend they don't have strategic impact, because they do. They shaped the story, they shaped public perception, they made people sympathetic, they made people curious, they made people look into it, and even if you don't know the lawsuit details, you now associate Julia Reagan with loss. And her family's claim is that the loss was preventable, that emotional association matters. Now, before I ask you the final question, I want to say something else. The internet turned this into a mystery, a trend, into memes, but Julia Reagan was a real person, a real wife, a real mom, a real grandmother, and I think it's worth remembering that at the center of all of this is a family that lost someone. So you can be skeptical, you can question intent, but you can still be respectful. And honestly, that's what makes this story such a Utah moment. Because Utah is a place where massive institutions exist right next to deeply personal communities. And sometimes those two worlds collide. Okay, so back to the question I promised at the beginning. When you look at the Julia Reagan billboards, what do you think they truly were? Do you think this was purely a grieving husband's tribute to his wife? A way to keep her memory alive on the largest canvas available? Or do you think this was also meant to help him win a lucrative lawsuit against one of Utah's biggest employers and most powerful organizations? Was it love? Or was it strategy? Or a combination of both? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want more long-form Utah deep dives like this, the mysteries, the crime, the history, all of it, make sure you subscribe. And comment what story I should cover next, because I've got a lot more coming.